December 4th, 1969. Aqua Njeri was 19 years old, sleeping next to her fiancé, Fred Hampton, the head of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. The next thing I remember is someone entering our room, shaking Fred, saying, "Chairman, Chairman, wake up, wake up." Plaster was falling from the ceiling. You could smell the gunpowder from the shots being fired. If you've ever been caught in that kind of chaos, 5 minutes feels like 5 hours. It feels endless. The shooting started again. Then I heard an unfamiliar voice say, "He's not going to make it now." Fred Hampton's life was taken by his own government. But before that, he was a leader in a movement that brought in a new kind of activism, a movement that became a target because of its ability to unite people. 1964 was a landmark year for race relations, when, on July 2nd, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. During the 1960s, race relations in the U.S. were going through a turning point. Activists achieved major civil rights victories, and the Jim Crow era came to an end. Still, by the end of the decade, Black communities across the country faced deep social and economic divides. Black Americans continued to experience high poverty rates, poor housing, unemployment, and a lack of political representation. These inequalities, along with rising violence from law enforcement, led to uprisings across the nation. Many young Black activists became disillusioned. The change they had hoped for hadn't come. After a Black teenager in San Francisco lost his life in a police encounter, 2 activists from Oakland, California, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, founded what was first called the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Newton, who studied law, knew that in California, open carry of firearms was legal if the weapon wasn't concealed. The Panthers started to patrol their communities. As time went on, the movement grew in popularity. Some confrontations with police made the Black Panther Party known across the country. There were serious allegations against the party, but the public narratives about these events were often one-sided and mostly shaped by law enforcement. The media portrayed the Panthers as overly aggressive and militant. They say our goal is to harm all white people. But the truth is, even though the Panthers called for radical change, what they actually wanted was a revolution to dismantle capitalism. What they called a revolution doesn't sound so extreme today. They focused on socialism as a way to solve economic issues. They looked to countries like Canada, a democratic country with a more socialist economy. Their goal was to build a democratic socialist United States, one that would be fairer and more humane. The Panthers released a 10-point program demanding sweeping social reforms, an end to police brutality, guaranteed jobs for Black Americans, better housing, education, and the release of unjustly imprisoned individuals. Local Panther chapters started forming all over the country. They launched social services called survival programs. The Panthers said, "Show it in action." If you want to change people's lives and really connect with them, you've got to offer the support they actually need. They ran food and clothing drives, free community clinics, and even health screenings. These programs were mostly run by volunteers and supported by donations from local businesses. One of the most impactful was the Free Breakfast for Children program. We're in 1966 to 67, the wealthiest country in the world, and children were going to school hungry, especially in Black neighborhoods. So their first effort was feeding kids before school. All children had to do was show up. Around this time, Aqua Njeri, then known as Deborah Johnson, met Fred Hampton. I was a student at Wright City College and Fred came to speak. He said, "In our breakfast program, we feed over 3,000 kids a week. We're serious about making power to the people real. We're not just sitting around talking." And I thought, damn, this guy's really about action. Fred Hampton grew up in Maywood, Illinois, just west of Chicago. In 1967, at 19, he became president of the local NAACP youth chapter. Soon after, he was invited to join the Black Panther Party, where he quickly rose in leadership. You can lock up a revolutionary, but you can't lock up the revolution. Thanks to his natural charisma and leadership, he moved up fast. He was only 21 when he began leading and organizing the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. Not long after meeting him, Njeri and Hampton became a couple. Anyone who ever met him or heard him speak will tell you, he didn't play around. He was the real deal. Chicago, in particular, became a place where the party's ideas really resonated. It was the second largest city in the U.S., and decades of discriminatory policies had made it one of the most segregated. The city's mayor at the time, Richard J. Daley, was strongly against racial integration of neighborhoods. In the 1950s, the city began redeveloping certain areas, forcing out low-income residents and moving them into overcrowded high-rise buildings in already packed parts of town. Black residents were mostly pushed to the south and west sides of Chicago. A large Puerto Rican community lived in Lincoln Park, and poor white residents were concentrated in Uptown. These groups were dealing with similar issues: neglected schools, unsafe and cramped housing, and a lack of health care. And they were all being drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. Very few of these communities had access to proper medical care. In 1969, Hampton became the leader of the local Black Panther Party, and he helped spark an unexpected alliance: a coalition of activists across racial lines coming together against a corrupt city government that was threatening their communities. What united them all was poverty. So they started building a movement based on class solidarity, something that went beyond race. They were all up against the same challenges, and that shared struggle brought them together. Hampton called the group the Rainbow Coalition. It brought together the Black Panthers, a Puerto Rican organization called the Young Lords, and a mostly poor white Appalachian group called the Young Patriots, made up of rural migrants who had come to Chicago looking for economic opportunities. We don't hate white people. We hate the oppressor, whether you're white, black, brown, or yellow. I don't mean we're gonna sit around singing Kumbaya and sewing blankets. I mean bringing people together around shared values. Not agreeing on everything, but who can say kids don't deserve healthy food? Hampton and other Panthers helped the Young Lords and Young Patriots start their own community programs. They organized protests together, and it worked. Members of the party traveled around the country to help form local chapters of the Rainbow Coalition, not only where Panther chapters already existed, but also in rural white communities, bringing their message of solidarity. People were shocked. These were groups that weren't expected to get along. But here they were, working together like brothers in struggle, as revolutionaries pushing back against a capitalist system. And that was seen as a threat by the state, at the local level, and nationally. In 1968, the FBI sent out an internal memo outlining goals like prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement, disrupt efforts to unite radical black nationalist groups. That memo didn't name Hampton specifically, but by 1969, Fred Hampton matched everything they were warning about. There was revolution in the air, and the way the Panthers had started breaking down racial boundaries, especially through the charismatic leadership of people like Fred Hampton, made him look like a bigger threat than anyone had before. A bigger threat than even Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. In one FBI memo about the Panthers' breakfast program, they claimed that the real goal was to poison young minds with anti-white propaganda and to raise children in an environment of hate and violence. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, labeled the Black Panther Party the biggest internal threat to the security of the United States. They launched a counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO, a campaign meant to attack political groups viewed as being against the U.S. government. Their tactics often crossed legal lines. They used methods like ending people's lives, smearing reputations, spreading false narratives, locking people up or forcing them into exile, often in ways that weren't legally justified. Several Black Panther members lost their freedom or their lives, including some of the founders. In Chicago, the party was also targeted by Mayor Daley and the Chicago Police Department. Their offices were set on fire at least 3 times. People disappeared. You never saw them again. Hampton, who had become a rising star at just 21, knew he was in danger. He was arrested in 1968 for allegedly taking ice cream from a delivery truck and giving away $71 worth to neighborhood kids. In 1969, he was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison. He appealed the case and was released on bail. But that appeal was later denied, and he was ordered to return to prison on December 6th. Free Fred Hampton! Free Fred Hampton! Around 4 a.m. on December 4th, 14 Chicago police officers arrived at Fred Hampton's apartment on the west side of the city. Inside were Hampton, Jerry, and 7 other Panthers, all sleeping. I was pregnant. The first thing I remember was that Fred had fallen asleep while talking on the phone. I saw him look up once and then slowly rest his head back down. The officers broke down the door and fired at Mark Clark, a guest from another Panther chapter. They also fired at Brenda Harris, an 18-year-old who was asleep. Then they opened fire in the direction of Hampton's bed. I moved onto the bed next to Fred because they were shooting directly into our mattress. Someone who came into the room started yelling, "Stop shooting! Stop shooting! There's a pregnant sister in here!" Eventually, the gunfire stopped, and Jerry was forced into the kitchen. That's when she heard another voice say, "He's barely hanging on. He's probably not going to make it." She assumed they were talking about Fred. Then one of the officers said, "He's already gone." As they were taking her out, one of them pressed a gun against her stomach, even though she was in handcuffs. I didn't look toward our bedroom. I didn't know what I'd see or how I'd react. The police had fired nearly 100 rounds. Fred Hampton and Mark Clark didn't survive. The 7 remaining Panthers were arrested. The police smiled as they removed Fred Hampton's body from the apartment. The Chicago police and the state's attorney's office quickly pushed a version of events claiming this had been a shootout, a gun battle, an exchange of fire. Officers involved in the raid said they were fired upon from 4 different rooms of the apartment. Before I even stepped through the door, 3 shots came from the back bedroom. They told a story that didn't make sense, a made-up version of events that once again blamed the Black Panther Party. Yes, we saw gunfire coming from 2 bedrooms. This attack by the Black Panthers on police shows the true nature of the party. But experts, lawyers hired by the Panthers, and independent journalists investigated the scene. The Panthers even opened the apartment to the public so people could see it for themselves. And a very different picture came into focus. It became clear the police had opened fire without cause. Out of nearly 100 shots fired, only 1 might have come from the Panthers, most likely Mark Clark, who had been at the front door. The so-called bullet holes that police claimed were fired by the Panthers were, in fact, nail holes in the walls. Later, it was revealed that the FBI had supported the Chicago police in this raid. The FBI had an informant inside the Black Panther Party, a man named William O'Neill. He had been made head of security and acted as a bodyguard to Fred Hampton. It was later revealed that before the raid, O'Neill had likely drugged Fred Hampton. There's evidence showing that Fred was possibly sedated, which made it easier for him to be captured. This made William O'Neill one of the most controversial and divisive figures in the party's history, and his role in Fred Hampton's death has remained one of the most talked-about moments ever associated with the Black Panther legacy. O'Neill gave the FBI a hand-drawn layout of the apartment, which the FBI passed on to Chicago police. And evidence suggests he also intentionally weakened Hampton before the raid took place. In the years that followed, O'Neill lived a seemingly normal life. For a long time, the public didn't know he had played a role in what happened. But eventually, the truth came out. He appeared in the 1971 documentary The Murder of Fred Hampton, where he first spoke about the events and admitted his betrayal. He expressed some regret for what he had done, but also said it was part of his job as an FBI informant. Over time, the psychological weight of it all became too much. In 1990, many years after the raid, and after new documentaries and materials about the Black Panther Party had been released, O'Neill ended his own life. His passing added an even more painful note to an already devastating chapter in history. In the years after Fred Hampton's life was taken, police and the FBI continued to imprison dozens of Panthers across the country. The official Black Panther Party continued to exist until 1982, but its numbers dropped sharply, and it was never the same again. Fred Hampton believed in revolution. Those in power wanted to eliminate him and what he stood for, but they didn't succeed completely. Chairman Fred, he lives. Even after the state cracked down and dismantled the party as an organization, the legacy of the Panthers still lives on. Today, Fred Hampton's work is still alive, through some of the very same programs that once made him a target. A lot of what the Panthers built is now part of American life. Before the Panthers started free breakfast programs in schools, there were no such programs. Free clinics? They didn't exist before the Panthers. Legal aid at major universities? That's a legacy of their model. Heart disease screenings, now formally recognized by the CDC and others, were first offered in Black communities by the Panthers. None of this existed before the party. Drop a comment. Would you call this revolutionary?